Alright, so this video is about closures, and this is a question that has been asked to me and two of my friends, one of them being having 4 years of experience and the other having 1 year of experience. And closures are something, if you have some experience with JavaScript, the chances are that you know closures, but you just don't know that they're called closures. And that's the reason, instead of answering the question, what are closures, I'm gonna ask you a question. What is the use of closures? So obviously, as I said, you probably know what closures are, and closures are self-invoking functions. If that strikes, then yeah, basically you know what it is. So function, and I'm just gonna say console.log invoked, and then you call that function. So what I basically did here was I declared a function. This is an anonymous function, so it doesn't have a name, and at the same time I just invoked it, like I called that function, and you can see it says invoked right here. Now this is very similar to me doing function fn to gn, let's say gn, okay, and console.log test, and then calling that function right there. So the difference between the two is, well, here I just called it as soon as I created it, plus it was an anonymous function, it didn't have a name. Here it is not an anonymous function, it has a name, and you can call it again and again, and that kind of gives you the hint as to why you could use anonymous functions, or why you could use self-invoking functions or closures. But why would you want to create a function that basically just works once and can't be reused again? The answer to this is scoping. Think about it for a moment. If I create a variable n equals 0, and let's say I create a function increment, and all this function does is it does n++ and maybe returns it. And if I'm returning it, I want to increment it first and then return it. So that's all this function does. Now if I call increment, it returns 1, because initially it was 0, it got incremented to 1. Now the problem with this is I could basically do something like this, and when I call increment again, now the value is 5 instead of being 2. The reason for that was because I changed the value of n. So you see the problem there. Basically this variable is accessible throughout this object, which is currently we're in window, which means it's accessible throughout window, and that's a big problem, because we want to secure this variable from being modified. So what could I do? What could I do to prevent that? One thing, let's try to devise a solution for this. So what if I create a function increment, and I declare the variable here where n is equal to 0, and I do n++ or ++n and return. Now what do you think is going to happen? So let's say I do increment, it returns 1 as expected, but when I call it again, it returns 1 again, and the reason for that is because this n is being redeclared. So okay, what if we do let? If you know the solution to this, then you probably have watched my where versus let versus const video. If you don't know what the solution for this is, what the answer is going to be, then I think you should watch that video. I'll just link it right here. So now if I call it, it does the same again, because let basically creates a local variable within the braces, and essentially that's exactly what we're doing here as well, because we are not in an if condition or any sort of block apart from the function itself. So we're just redeclaring a new variable and we're incrementing that variable, so that's not very useful. Okay, what if I create the variable, let's say m, because I already created n, and I can just go ahead and create this increment function. Okay, I'm just redeclaring the function. So here what I can do is I can do ++m. but the problem is I can't increment m because it's not a number anymore. It's not a number, it's undefined, and I can't do that. So the solution to that is closures. So let's say, where is it? Yeah, to create this function, this is a self-invoking function, and basically what I do is I create a variable n is equal to 0, and let's say I return a new function, okay, that just returns plus plus n. So this is the syntax for an anonymous function. Basically this is the same as return n, return plus plus n. So let's say I increment n and return it. Now I also need to save it somewhere, so I can do where increment function, let's give it a different name, increment function is equal to function. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a self-invoking function that is a closure. That closure gets executed and it creates a variable n and then returns this anonymous function. This anonymous function is then stored inside increment function. So I can say increment function, I call increment function and I get 1, which is expected. Now when I call increment function again, it returns 2 because this variable was created once and this function has access to this variable, okay, but since this variable was created inside of this self-invoking function, the scope was basically within the self-invoking function, and because of this now when I try to access n, I'm only going to be able to access the previous value that I created. So instead of calling it n, if I call it num, okay, and then I call increment function, this was 6. Okay, let me see this again. Oh, that's because this is plus plus n. It doesn't have n in here in the function, so it's accessing from the window object. So I just have to do plus plus num. And now if I call this function, okay, it says 1 2 3, and if I say num, uncaught reference error, num is not defined. So basically what we did was we made the scope of num to be within this function, and then we returned a function that basically modifies this num. So this variable still exists, it's not been deleted, but it can only be accessed by this anonymous function now, which is stored inside increment function. So that's what closures are. They're basically self-invoking functions. Self-invoking functions are nothing but functions that are anonymous, and they're executed as soon as they're created, and basically they're used to creating variables that should only be accessed by some particular piece of code, some particular functions, and that's the purpose of using closures. So if you come across this question in interviews, you can basically give them this explanation, and always remember, if you whatever name you remember self-invoking functions with, if you remember them as self-invoking functions, then just map it in your head that when they're talking about closures, they're actually talking about self-invoking functions. It's just a different name for the same. So hope you enjoyed this video, hope it was helpful for you, and yeah, I'd if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and check out my other videos on this channel. I'm gonna share some of those at the end of this video as well. And if you want to know more about var, let and const, then you can definitely check out my video regarding the same. There is also another video that I've made regarding this keyword in JavaScript, so be sure to check those out as well. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.